Speaking to the point of
Honourable
order.
Judith Collins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I noted that Mr Hipkins referred to ministers and Mr Seymour receiving funding or funds from certain people. That implies that they're receiving it personally. I think the point needs to be made, doesn't it, and clarified, if people are receiving funding to their parties, not to them personally. It's quite a different situation than the conflict of interest situation that Mr Hipkins has raised.
And to that point of order, Mr Speaker, Judith Collins is 100% wrong. There are ministers in her government, of which she is part, who have declared political donations to their parties, and exempted themselves from ministerial decisions on the basis of those donations. And he's one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking to the point of order.
Yes, I'll call you, the Honourable Chris Bishop.
Speaking to the point of order, that of course is correct in the way that this government has taken the advice from the Cabinet Office and the way that the previous Labor government took advice from the Cabinet Office, where ministers are careful to recuse themselves from decisions where they have a conflict of interest based upon advice. That is wholly different to what Mr Hipkins is essentially implying through his questions. Mr Seymour is a minister in this government, but we are not talking about an active ministerial decision where a conflict of interest may arise. We are traversing something that happened 2 years ago, and in relation to the particular matter where he was the MP for Epsom. We are not talking about a ministerial decision. There is no conflict of interest.
Speaker, I think the member is deflecting somewhat from my question, which was whether a donation was received by David Seymour in his political capacity, whether he received a political donation. He's trying to then divert that onto other things. It is a simple question as to whether a political donation was received. It's absolutely acceptable for the Prime Minister to be asked that. It's also very acceptable for the Prime Minister to be expected to know who is funding his ministers.
I think there are a number of points on both sides that are of interest in a case like this. I'd refer members to Speaker's Ruling 181, and I'll read these words, but I'm also not particularly reaffirming this today. I just want to take a bit of time, given the points that have been raised. And the bit that I would call attention to is, although the Prime Minister is not answerable for statements or actions taken purely in a non-ministerial capacity, such as those taken as a party leader or in a personal capacity, the Prime Minister can be asked about how such actions, statements may or may not affect, in his view, his view of a minister's judgment and his confidence in the minister. So the questions were along those lines. I think that's where we get into a bit of trouble is the specifics of the question, and that's what I want to have a bit of a think about over the next 24 hours. Supplementary.
Why hasn't he demanded...
Point of order, the Honourable Judith Collins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, Mr Hipkins has done it again. He has actually slurred all the ministers by saying the House is entitled to know who is funding his ministers. Now, actually, we're funded by the taxpayer, just like everybody in this House. We are not funded by particular people, and I think it is quite wrong for him to get away with implying otherwise.
Yes, in the grand scheme of things, I probably didn't pick that up, but I think it might be worth just, Mr Hipkins, might be worth withdrawing that part of your...
Mr Speaker, I think it was very clear from the context of all of the issues I've raised, I was referring to political donations. Very happy to clarify that.
Thank you. The Honourable David Seymour.
Mr Speaker, it would be the easiest thing in the world for me to just stand up and say that there's been no such donation to me, but I'm not going to do that, and I would urge all members of the House to think very carefully about what the implications of every member declaring every possible donation or not at every point of questioning. If you really want to go there, then we could have a very different type of politics.
Hold on. There was supposed to be a point of order, not a statement. I think we'll move now to, have you got further supplementaries?
To the Prime Minister, why hasn't he demanded a resignation letter from David Seymour, particularly given that David Seymour himself said in 2023 that ministers interfering in judicial decisions should be, quote, prepared to resign the post if the Prime Minister thinks that's in the best interests of New Zealand.
Clearer to the member, but what I've said before, which is the Minister wrote the letter while he was an MP, before he was a Minister, before he was in this government. And I'm just reminded of the words of the Canadian songstress Alanis Morissette, who said, "Isn't it ironic? Because let me give you 4 names: Michael Wood, Mecca Faiteri, Stuart Nash, and how about Kerry Allen?"
That's enough. Thank you. We'll go into a period of silence now while we have question number 2.
Tēnā koe te pika.
That includes everyone on the Labour front bench.